The police dog trembles, his paw striking the glass in rapid, frantic taps that echo through the quiet house like warning shots. His breath fogs the window as his eyes lock on something unseen in the fading dusk, his body rigid with fear and determination. Inside, the parents freeze, torn between denial and rising terror as the silence outside thickens into something unnatural. The dog's claws scrape harder, more desperate, as if time is slipping away. And then, ears pinned, tail low, muscles coiled, he turns his head toward the woods with a low, throbbing growl. Why does he look like he's begging them to follow before it's too late? The morning the world still felt safe began like any other for the Harlans, wrapped in the quiet comfort of routine as their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, trailed through the sunlit kitchen with the gentle clumsiness of childhood while their police dog Coda padded behind her with unwavering devotion. A seasoned German shepherd with a broad chest, storm, gray coat, and amber eyes that seemed to read the world more deeply than any human. Coda followed Lily as though the gravity of his life centered around her small footsteps. He had been Michael Harlan's K-9 partner for years before retiring into family life, yet even in retirement his instincts never dulled. He scanned corners, tracked scents on the wind, and positioned himself between the girl and any shifting shadow like a silent guardian. Their home sat on the edge of a dense forest that seemed peaceful in daylight but carried an old, unknowable hush beneath its canopy, a place where Lily liked to play while Coda stood sentinel a few steps behind, always alert, always listening. Their days were simple, filled with backyard games, warm breakfasts, and evening walks where the amber glow of sunset washed everything in gentle light, softening even Coda's hardened expression. But lately, small things had begun to fray at the edges of their peace. Coda stiffening at the tree line during dusk, his ears pricking to sounds the family couldn't hear, faint disturbances in the soil near the fence line, the fleeting feeling that something watched from deeper in the woods. At first the Harlans dismissed it as lingering police habits in their loyal dog, instincts trained to see threats in every rustle. But each day Coda grew more restless, pacing windows at night, positioning himself at Lily's bedroom door as though guarding her from an unseen force. Still, life carried on, and Lily's laughter continued to echo through the yard while Coda hovered close, tense beneath the surface. There was a moment, a tiny, forgettable moment they would later replay endlessly, when Coda paused in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, staring hard into the forest as Lily skipped ahead, his breathing slowing, his muscles tightening as though fate had brushed past him. And though he eventually followed her, something in his gaze had shifted, sharpening with a quiet dread that threaded through the air like a warning. It was the first soft ripple of a storm none of them knew was already coming, carried on the cold breath of the woods and felt only by the dog who understood danger long before humans sensed its shadow. The days that followed unfolded like a tightening vise, each moment pulling the Harlans closer to a danger they couldn't yet name, but that Coda sensed with every fiber of his trained, battle-forged instincts, his restlessness growing into something sharp and relentless as he shadowed Lily with near-obsessive vigilance, refusing to let her stray even a few steps from his side. At first the family tried to soothe him, brushing off his tense pacing, his rigid posture, the low rumble vibrating in his chest whenever the wind shifted from the direction of the forest, but his unease seeped into the air around them, turning ordinary moments into scenes tinged with dread. The forest, once a backdrop to Lily's laughter, began to feel like a presence, watchful, waiting, its cool green silence now heavy with unspoken warning. Coda's behavior escalated subtly at first, rising in the middle of the night to patrol the hallway, stiffening suddenly during breakfast as though catching the tail end of a sound no one else heard, placing his weight between Lily and the open sliding door every time it was cracked for fresh air. But soon the tension sharpened into clear, urgent alarm. On one late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the sky reddened like a slow-burning ember, Lily wandered toward the garden to collect fallen pine cones, and Coda lunged forward with a force that startled even Michael, planting himself in front of the girl with his hackles raised. His eyes fixed on a distant shape at the edge of the woods, a fleeting movement, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but enough to send a cold ripple through the air. Michael scanned the trees but saw nothing, only the slow sway of branches, yet Coda wouldn't move, his body taut, his breathing shallow, as though he was bracing for something to emerge. That night, Coda barely slept. He patrolled the house with relentless precision, circling windows, pausing beneath Lily's nightlight glow, pressing his nose to the gap at the bottom of her door as if testing for intruders. The Harlans, exhausted, dismissed it as lingering working dog instinct, but deep inside, a quiet unease began to settle in them too, an unshakable feeling that something was shifting in the world around their home. 2 days later, the first physical sign appeared, a patch of disturbed soil near the tree line, wide and uneven, as though something large had moved through in haste or panic. Michael crouched to study it, but there were no clear tracks, just a gouged-out trail that disappeared deeper into the woods. Coda stood rigid beside him, tail lowered, ears pinned, watching the path with the expression of a soldier recognizing the scent of war. That evening, while the family prepared dinner, Coda moved to the living room window and froze, body locked, head tilted, breath halted, his stare fixed so intensely on the yard that the hairs along his spine rose like a warning signal. When Michael joined him, he again saw nothing but dimming light settling over the grass. Still, Coda remained motionless, as if tracking something invisible moving just beyond the limits of human sight. And then came the night the sounds began, soft at first, barely perceptible taps or crunches of leaves outside the windows, enough to make Coda lift his head and growl low in his throat, but not enough to fully wake the sleeping family. But on the fourth night, the noises grew louder, the snap of a branch, the shuffle of heavy steps, the kind of deliberate movement that sent Coda lunging to the front door with a deep, resonant bark that jolted the Harlans upright in their beds. Michael threw open the porch light, illuminating nothing but a still, quiet yard, but Coda kept barking, each sound tearing from him with a desperation that rattled the walls, his eyes locked on a spot at the corner of the yard where the fence met the woods. The next morning, they found a section of fencing bent outward, as if something had pushed through from the outside. Michael stared at it for a long time, his breathing thinning, while Coda sniffed the ground feverishly, pacing in tight circles before stopping abruptly and lifting his head toward the forest, muscles twitching beneath his coat. That very afternoon Lily, innocent, trusting, wandered toward the yard's edge again, drawn to her little patch of wildflowers. She stood humming softly, picking petals, unaware that Coda had halted behind her and gone still, head lifted, body trembling. Without warning, he sprinted forward and nudged her hard enough to knock her onto the soft grass. Michael rushed outside, startled and frustrated, but Coda didn't retreat. He planted himself between Lily and the trees again, rigid with instinctive fear. That was the moment Michael finally felt the truth settle like ice in his bloodstream. Coda wasn't being anxious. He was preparing, protecting, predicting. The tension in the air thickened through the week, every day layered with new fear. Doors left shut but found ajar in the morning, the sudden disappearance of neighborhood pets, an eerie silence in the woods where birds once filled the air with noise. The forest seemed to breathe closer to their home, its shadows lengthening earlier, its movements more deliberate, as though something within it had fixed its attention on the little girl Coda guarded so fiercely. One evening, just before the sun slipped beyond the horizon, Lily's small shoe sat by the back door, mud still fresh along the soles. She had gone outside moments earlier to retrieve a toy she'd forgotten on the porch. Coda followed her, as always, but this time something pulled him. The faintest sound, the sharpest scent, away from her for only a heartbeat. And in that single heartbeat, Lily stepped past the corner of the house and out of his sight. When Coda snapped back, his reaction was instantaneous, violent. He bolted toward the spot she had been standing, only to find empty grass and a faint trail leading toward the woods, one that made him let out a sound the Harlans would never forget, a deep, guttural cry threaded with panic, grief, and warning. Inside, the Harlans heard the sound and ran, but by the time they reached the yard, Coda was already tearing through the trees, following a scent he recognized too clearly: Lily's. What the Harlans didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Coda had sensed the predator that had been circling closer each night, the one that had been testing the boundaries of the yard, the one whose scent he'd detected days ago etched into that disturbed patch of soil. He had felt it move near Lily, too close, too silently. And now, with the light fading and the woods swallowing the last traces of day, the air was thick with the pulse of danger. The Harlans raced after Coda, calling Lily's name into the dense stillness, but the forest absorbed their voices, swallowing them whole. Coda's barks grew distant, echoing through the trees like frantic alarms, each one filled with rising desperation as he followed the trail farther and farther into the deepening dark. Then suddenly, silence. A silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. And somewhere ahead, hidden by shadows and rooted in the cold heart of the forest, something stirred. Something that had finally gotten what it had been waiting for. The only question, as the Harlands stumbled deeper into the darkness with fear clawing at their throats, was whether Coda would reach Lily in time, or whether the woods would swallow them both before they ever found her. The forest swallowed Coda in shadows as he charged forward, muscles burning, breath slicing through the cold night air. Driven by a single instinct that rose above fear itself, reach Lily before the thing stalking her did. The presence he had sensed for days, the predator whose scent grew sharper with every desperate stride he took. Behind him, the Harlands crashed through underbrush, torn between terror and hope, but Coda was already far ahead, following the faint trail of Lily's small footprints pressed into damp soil, the scent of her fear pulling him deeper into a darkness that seemed to pulse with movement. The woods tightened around him, branches whipping past, the air thickening with that same metallic tang he had recognized earlier, the smell of a wounded creature, large and desperate, the one that had been circling their home. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the silence, high and frightened, unmistakably Lily's, and Coda lunged toward the sound with a burst of ferocity that shook the forest floor. He broke into a small clearing where moonlight filtered weakly through the canopy, illuminating Lily crouched at the base of a fallen log, her tiny hands pressed to her face as she trembled. Between them and safety stood a massive, injured black bear, ribs protruding, patches of fur missing, one eye clouded with infection, its wounded body driving it into the frantic aggression that had pulled it dangerously close to human territory. It towered over Lily, swaying with the unstable rage of an animal pushed beyond its limits. Coda skidded to a stop, heart pounding, evaluating the impossible situation in a split-second instinct honed through years of service. Lily could not run, the bear would strike, and he was the only barrier between life and death. The bear let out a guttural roar that vibrated through the clearing and stepped toward Lily, lifting a paw heavy enough to crush her. But before it could swing, Coda launched himself forward with a speed fueled by pure devotion, slamming into the side of the massive creature and knocking it off balance long enough for Lily to crawl backward. The bear reeled, snapping its jaws inches from Coda's neck, but he twisted away, using every ounce of training to stay light on his feet despite the size difference. He barked sharply, warnings, commands, pleas for Lily to move, and she scrambled toward a cluster of roots where she could wedge herself out of reach. The bear recovered quickly, turning its full fury onto Coda, lunging with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground. Coda dodged again, but not fast enough to avoid the jagged swipe that tore into his shoulder, warm blood splattering across the leaves as he staggered, legs trembling. Pain blazed through him, but he held his ground, refusing to yield, positioning himself in front of Lily with a resolve that burned brighter than his fear. The Harlands burst into the clearing just in time to see Coda facing the bear alone, his chest heaving, his injured leg weakening beneath him, yet his posture unbreakable. Michael felt the world tilt as he watched his retired partner transform into the warrior he had once known, silent, fearless, unwavering. The bear charged again, driven by pain and confusion, and Coda met it head-on, using his remaining strength to latch onto the scruff of its neck, pulling with every ounce of power left in his battered body. The two crashed into the ground in a violent tangle of fur and fury, rolling dangerously close to a ravine hidden by dense brush. The earth crumbled beneath them, pebbles tumbling into the darkness below, but Coda refused to let go even as the edge gave way beneath his back paws. With a final, explosive surge that ripped through his injured muscles, he twisted his body in a way that redirected the bear's momentum, sending the massive creature tumbling over the edge of the ravine where it disappeared with a thunderous crash. Coda, dangling for a heartbeat, claws scraping desperately against loose soil, tried to pull himself back up, but exhaustion overtook him, and he slipped, falling halfway down the ravine before crashing onto a narrow ledge that halted his descent. The clearing went silent except for Lily's sobs and Michael's broken gasp as he sprinted to the edge, scanning the drop where Coda lay motionless against the rock wall, chest rising only in shallow, uneven breaths. For a terrifying moment, it looked as though the heroic dog who had given everything might not rise again. Lily cried out for him, her voice cracking with panic, but the only response was the wind whispering through the trees. Michael scrambled down the side with frantic, shaking hands, reaching Coda just as the dog lifted his head weakly, blinking through pain to find Lily's face above him. His tail gave the faintest thump, a whisper of reassurance, a silent promise that he had kept his word. Michael lifted him with trembling arms, feeling the warm blood soaking through the fabric of his shirt, and carried him back toward the clearing where Lily stood waiting, her hands clasped tightly against her chest as though holding her heart together. They made it only a few steps before Coda's body went limp again, his breathing faint, the forest spinning around them in a blur of fear and hope. The Harlans called for help with shaking voices, their desperation echoing through the trees as the last remnants of moonlight flickered across Coda's wounded form. And as Michael held him close, whispering silent gratitude into his fur, Coda slowly opened his eyes one more time, not in fear nor in pain, but in quiet triumph, the kind only a hero who has fulfilled his purpose can carry. In that moment, before the woods filled with the sound of distant sirens, before the chaos of rescue and the uncertainty of survival, one truth settled over them like a rising dawn. Coda had not just saved Lily's life, he had given every part of himself to ensure she would see another sunrise. And it all came down to one final, breathless thought that rippled through the stillness of the forest like a vow etched into the earth itself. No greater courage exists than the heart of a loyal dog. The hours that followed blurred into a fragile balance between hope and dread as Michael carried Coda through the forest, each step trembling beneath the weight of the wounded dog whose blood seeped slowly through his shirt, marking a crimson trail against the earth that had nearly claimed them. Lily walked closely beside him, her small hand gripping his sleeve with a determination that shook him to the core, her wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of Coda's breathing as though willing it not to fade. Sarah guided them through the trees, her voice low and breaking as she called the paramedics again and again, desperate for reassurance that help was coming. When they finally emerged from the woods into the pale glow of emergency lights, the sight of the waiting ambulance and animal rescue responders struck them with a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought Michael to his knees. The paramedics rushed forward, easing Coda from his arms and placing him gently onto a stretcher designed for larger injured animals, their movements swift but cautious as they wrapped his torn shoulder and steadied his uneven pulse. Lily stood trembling beside the stretcher, her hands hovering in the air as if afraid to touch and afraid not to, torn between the hope that he would survive and the terror of losing the dog who had been her shadow, her protector, her silent best friend from the moment she could walk. She finally reached out, brushing her fingers across his fur just as his eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, Coda stared up at her, his gaze soft despite the pain, a flicker of recognition passing between them that seemed to settle her frantic breathing. The rescuers lifted him into the vehicle, and the Harlans followed close behind, climbing in with a fear that felt almost like grief, their world suspended between what had nearly happened and what still might. At the emergency veterinary hospital, time moved strangely, rushing forward in chaotic bursts and then freezing entirely as they waited for news. The vet, a calm but deeply serious woman, explained the extent of Coda's injuries: deep lacerations along the shoulder and flank, significant blood loss, cracked ribs, and the dangerous exhaustion of a dog who had pushed beyond every physical boundary to save a child. Surgery would be long, uncertain, and delicate. When the doors to the surgical room closed, Lily sank into her mother's arms with a shuddering sob, her small body racked with guilt she could not contain. She whispered again and again that she shouldn't have gone outside, that she should have stayed close, that Coda was hurt because of her, each word tumbling out like a confession she feared would break her family apart. Michael knelt in front of her, pulling her into his arms with a tenderness that anchored them both as he told her the only truth that mattered: that none of what happened was her fault, that Coda did what he was born to do because he loved her more fiercely than anything in the world, and that his heroic choice was not a burden she should carry but a testament to the bond they shared. Still, her tears wouldn't stop, and she curled into him, clinging tightly while Sarah stroked her hair with trembling fingers. Hours passed before the vet finally returned, her scrubs stained but her expression softened with cautious relief. Coda had made it through the surgery, and though his recovery would be long and would require patience, medication, and physical therapy, he was alive. The weight of that single word, alive, broke something loose inside the Harlans, and Sarah wept openly, clutching Michael's hand as Lily pressed her face into his chest, her sobs turning from fear to overwhelming gratitude. When they were allowed to see him, Coda lay swathed in bandages, an IV tucked gently into his leg, his breathing slow but steady, his eyes opening weakly as Lily approached. She moved with the reverence of someone stepping into a sacred moment, her feet barely touching the ground as she reached out to stroke his muzzle. He shifted just enough to press his nose into her palm, a faint but deliberate gesture that flooded the room with warmth, proof that even in his weakened state, his first instinct was still to comfort her. Over the next days, the hospital room became a second home for the Harlans. They kept vigil at Coda's side, reading to him, whispering to him, letting him fall asleep to the sound of their voices. Lily brought him her favorite blanket, placing it gently across his paws each night, and Michael sat with him for hours, speaking to him the way he once had during long patrol nights when they had only each other to rely on. As Coda grew stronger, the staff began helping him stand again, guiding him through slow, careful steps that tested the limits of his healing body. Every small victory, a lifted head, a steady breath, a controlled step, became a moment of celebration for the Harlans, who were reminded again and again of the strength woven into the dog they loved. Weeks later, when Coda was finally cleared to return home, the hospital staff and rescuers gathered to see him off, many of them visibly moved by the loyalty and courage he had shown. Returning to the house felt surreal. The once quiet rooms seemed to welcome him back, the space reshaping itself around the dog who had fought so fiercely to return. Lily helped prepare a soft space for him near the window, arranging pillows and blankets with meticulous care, as if building a sanctuary worthy of the hero who would rest there. Coda settled into the spot with a sigh, closing his eyes as the familiar sense of home wrapped around him like warmth. In the months that followed, the Harlan family healed alongside him. Lily became his constant companion during his recovery exercises, walking slowly at his side as he regained strength, celebrating every milestone with unrestrained joy. Michael watched the two of them with a quiet pride that reached deep into the years he had spent training Coda, knowing that everything the dog had learned, every instinct he had sharpened, had led to the moment he saved his daughter's life. Sarah found herself pausing often to watch Coda as he rested, her gratitude woven into every glance, every meal she prepared for him, every gentle stroke of his fur when the family gathered together in the evenings. Though the forest still stood at the edge of their property, the Harlans no longer felt the same eerie silence emanating from it. In the wake of the investigation, wildlife experts confirmed that the injured bear had been behaving erratically due to infection and starvation, and with it gone, the woods seemed to exhale, returning to their natural rhythm. And yet, the Harlans never forgot how quickly safety could shift into danger, or how a single heartbeat could change everything. One morning, several months after the attack, Coda stepped into the yard on steady legs, lifting his head to breathe in the familiar sense of their peaceful world. Lily stood beside him, her hand resting lightly against his back as he surveyed their home with eyes that had seen darkness but chosen light. He turned his head toward her, his gaze soft, filled with the quiet depth of a protector who had nothing left to prove. She leaned against him, and together they watched the sunrise paint the world gold. In that gentle morning light, their bond felt like something sacred, built through years of love, tested by fear, and strengthened by courage that ran deeper than words. And as the sun climbed higher, casting warm rays across the yard where life had nearly changed forever, one truth pulsed through the air as clearly as Coda's steady heartbeat: heroes are not always the ones who speak or stand tallest or wear medals. Sometimes they walk on four paws, stay silent, and love with a loyalty fierce enough to face the darkest woods without hesitation. And sometimes the bravest thing in the world is simply a dog who refuses to let the people he loves walk into danger alone.